Imagine walking into a place where dreams are sold. A showroom lined with polished cars, gleaming under bright lights, the kind of place where every detail screams wealth and status. The smell of new leather fills the air, and every glossy hood reflects a promise of luxury. Now imagine stepping into that same place, heart steady, ready to buy, only to be told you don't belong there. Not because of your bank account, not because of your credit, but because of something you can't change, the color of your skin. That was the reality David Carter walked into one Saturday afternoon. David wasn't dressed in a suit or a tailored blazer. He wore dark jeans, a neat polo shirt, and a pair of spotless sneakers. To anyone else, he might have looked like a man out for a casual weekend stroll. But in his mind, he was here with purpose. He had been thinking of getting a new car for weeks, something sleek, something fast, something that reminded him of how far he had come from his humble beginnings. The dealership was buzzing with quiet energy. Salesmen hovered near the doors, waiting to pounce on customers who looked like money. A family admired a silver SUV, a young couple whispered excitedly over a convertible, and the hum of conversations blended with the soft instrumental music playing through hidden speakers. David stepped through the glass doors and looked around. He smiled politely, expecting someone to greet him. But instead of a warm welcome, the energy in the room shifted. One man, standing near the center of the showroom, locked eyes on him. Richard. The owner of the dealership. Richard was tall, with slick back hair and an expensive watch that gleamed as he folded his arms. He had a smile plastered across his face just moments before when he was shaking hands with another customer. But as soon as David walked in, that smile evaporated. His expression hardened. Instead of greeting David with a handshake or even a simple hello, Richard stepped directly into his path, blocking his view of the cars. "Sir," Richard said with a sharp tone, "this isn't the kind of place you can just walk into." David paused, confused for a moment. "Excuse me?" "These cars," Richard gestured broadly to the polished luxury vehicles around them, "they start at $80,000. Maybe you should try the used lot down the street." David blinked slowly, letting the words sink in. He felt the stares of others in the room, some pretending not to notice, others whispering to themselves. A salesman in the corner shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. David kept his voice calm, steady. "I'm interested in one of the new models. Could I see the spec sheet?" Richard chuckled under his breath. "Look, we don't let people like you waste our time. These cars aren't for everyone." His words tripped with arrogance, each syllable carrying the weight of prejudice. For a split second, David felt the old sting of anger, the familiar taste of humiliation that so many people like him knew too well. He had faced racism before, but somehow this cut deeper. Not because he hadn't seen it coming, but because of where he was. Standing in a dealership he had literally helped fund, his money keeping these lights on, his investments paying the salaries of the very staff who now stood silent. He looked around the showroom, at the customers and employees pretending not to hear, and then back at Richard. His mind raced with thoughts. Should he walk out? Should he argue? Should he reveal right now who he truly was? But instead of raising his voice or matching Richard's arrogance, David chose silence. He straightened his shoulders, pulled out his phone, and said in the calmest voice possible, "All right, then. If that's how you feel, let's handle this another way." Richard smirked, satisfied, thinking he had scared off a man who didn't belong. What he didn't know was that the words David had just spoken weren't empty. They were the spark of a storm about to crash down on his empire. And in that moment, the denial that Richard thought was just another power move became the first step in his own downfall. Because the man he had just humiliated wasn't an ordinary customer. He was the very man who held the strings to the dealership's survival. And Richard was about to find out just how costly his arrogance would be. To understand why this moment at the dealership was so powerful, you have to know who David Carter really was. David wasn't just another customer browsing for a car. He was a man who had built himself from the ground up. A man who knew what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, and doubted, and who had turned every insult into fuel for success. David grew up in a modest neighborhood on the south side of the city. His mother worked double shifts at a hospital, his father fixed cars in a small garage that barely kept the lights on. Money was always tight, but his parents gave him something far more valuable than wealth: discipline, resilience, and the belief that no dream was too big if he worked for it. As a teenager, David was fascinated by technology. While other kids played basketball after school, he spent hours in the public library, reading books about coding, engineering, and business. He didn't have the newest gadgets, so he learned to repair old computers that neighbors would throw away. By the time he was 17, he was building websites for local businesses. College wasn't easy. David earned scholarships, took side jobs, and sometimes went hungry just to afford textbooks. But he never quit. He graduated with a degree in computer science and a vision that stretched far beyond a 9-to-5 job. He wanted to build something of his own. And he did. His first company was a small tech startup he ran from his apartment. With long nights and endless determination, he grew it into a thriving business. From there, he expanded into multiple ventures: software solutions, real estate, logistics. Every move was calculated, every risk weighed carefully. By his early 40s, David had built an empire worth millions. But here's the thing: David never flaunted his success. He wasn't the type to show up in gold watches or brag about his wealth on social media. He believed true power didn't shout, it whispered. The strongest moves were made quietly, with strategy, not noise. That's why so few people knew the full extent of his influence. Behind the scenes, David invested in dozens of businesses across the city. Restaurants, apartment complexes, logistics companies, and yes, even a luxury car dealership downtown. He did it through his private equity firm, which used shell companies to hold investments. On paper, his name was invisible. To the outside world, he was just another entrepreneur. But in reality, his money and his decisions kept many businesses alive, including Richard's dealership. Months earlier, when Richard's sales had been dropping and bankruptcy was looming, David's firm stepped in. Millions were quietly invested to keep the doors open, to make sure suppliers kept delivering cars, and to pay the very staff now standing silent in the showroom. Without David's funding, Richard's empire would have collapsed long ago. And yet, Richard had no idea who his silent partner was. To Richard, he was the king of the dealership, strutting around the showroom with his expensive watch and smug smile. He thought he had built this empire alone. He thought the money came from faceless investors who admired him. He thought he was untouchable. But the truth was, every polished hood, every sparkling car on that showroom floor, every paycheck handed to his staff, it all traced back to David Carter. And that's what made the moment so ironic. Here was Richard, a man who worshipped appearances, dismissing a customer he thought didn't belong. He couldn't see past David's casual jeans and sneakers. He didn't recognize power when it stood right in front of him. He only saw what he wanted to see: a man he assumed couldn't afford his cars. What Richard didn't realize was that the man he just insulted didn't need to buy a car to prove anything. He could buy the entire dealership, and he already had. David stood quietly, holding his phone, his expression calm. But inside, he was remembering every late night he had worked, every obstacle he had overcome, every person who had ever told him you don't belong. He wasn't shocked by Richard's arrogance. He had seen it before. What made this moment different was the irony. The arrogance of a man who believed he was in control, blind to the fact that his fate rested in the hands of the very person he was insulting. And David knew, right then and there, that this wasn't just about a car. This was about something bigger. A lesson that needed to be taught. Richard had made a mistake. A costly one. And soon, he was going to find out exactly who David Carter was. If David Carter's life was built on humility and hard work, Richard's life was built on arrogance and appearances. Richard wasn't born into wealth, but once he got a taste of success, it consumed him. He had managed to work his way into the dealership business years ago, starting as a salesman. To his credit, he was good at selling. He knew how to flatter, how to play the part of the smooth talker. But as his position grew, so did his ego. When Richard finally became the owner of his own dealership, it wasn't just about selling cars anymore. To him, the dealership was a throne room, and he was the king. Every polished hood was a crown jewel, every luxury model a trophy that reflected his self-importance. He didn't just see cars, he saw status, power, and a stage to parade his inflated sense of superiority. He loved the spotlight. He loved shaking hands with wealthy businessmen in tailored suits, offering champagne to high-profile clients, and posing for pictures with his arm draped over exotic sports cars. In Richard's world, image was everything. And just as much as he adored those who fit his idea of wealth, he disdained those who didn't. Customers who came in wearing simple clothes, single mothers asking about financing options, working-class families looking for something reliable, Richard brushed them aside. To him, they weren't worth his time. His philosophy was simple: if you didn't look rich, you didn't belong in his showroom. The truth was, Richard's dealership wasn't doing nearly as well as he wanted people to believe. Behind the gleaming glass walls and flashy ads, the numbers were dropping. The economy had slowed, sales were slipping, and suppliers were threatening to cut ties. His empire wasn't as stable as he pretended. But Richard knew how to fake confidence. He strutted across the showroom floor like he owned the city itself, while in the back office, bills piled up and financial stress gnawed at him. That was when David Carter's firm stepped in. Richard didn't know David's name, he didn't care. All he saw was a private equity group willing to invest millions into his dealership. In his mind, this wasn't a partnership, it was validation. Someone had recognized his brilliance and wanted to back him. He signed the deal without asking questions. To him, money was money, and as long as it kept his lights on and his showroom stocked, he didn't care where it came from. What mattered was that he could keep playing the role of the untouchable dealership king. After the deal went through, Richard's arrogance only grew. He strutted even harder. He bought a new Rolex, upgraded his wardrobe, and made sure every client saw the flash of his watch when he shook their hand. He told his staff that his connections were so strong that bankruptcy was impossible. The irony, of course, was that the very man keeping him afloat was the same man he had just humiliated at the dealership doors. But Richard couldn't see that. Blinded by ego, he thought he had built his empire on his own charm, his own brilliance. He believed his smile and slick words were what kept business alive. He couldn't imagine that someone else, especially someone like David, could hold the real power. This blindness wasn't just arrogance, it was self-destruction waiting to happen. Because when you build your entire empire on appearances, it only takes one crack in the mirror for the whole illusion to shatter. And the crack was coming. The Saturday afternoon when David walked casually into the dealership, Richard didn't see a loyal investor or a silent partner. He saw someone who didn't fit his image. And because of that, he dismissed him without a thought. That single moment of prejudice, that split-second decision to judge by appearances, would soon unravel everything Richard thought he had built. Because while Richard believed he was the king of the showroom, in reality, he was a man standing on a throne made of glass. And David Carter was about to shatter it. Saturday afternoons in the city always carried a certain rhythm. Streets buzzing with traffic, restaurants spilling with weekend diners, and shopping centers alive with energy. For David Carter, this Saturday was supposed to be simple. No meetings, no boardrooms, no financial reports, just a man taking some time to himself. He had been thinking about buying a new car for months. Not because he needed one. His garage already held more than enough vehicles, SUVs for practicality, a couple of classics for nostalgia, and even a luxury sedan that turned heads wherever he drove. But this time, he wanted something different. Something sleek, modern, powerful, a reward to himself for years of quiet grinding behind the scenes. So, David decided to stop by the dealership. Not as the silent investor. Not as the man whose millions kept its lights glowing. But as a customer. A man walking in off the street, just like anyone else. He dressed simply, dark jeans, a clean polo shirt, sneakers. To the outside world, he looked like any middle-aged man with a calm presence and an easy stride. He didn't arrive in a flashy car, either. He drove up in one of his more modest vehicles, parked it quietly, and walked across the dealership lot. From the outside, the dealership looked like a palace of glass and chrome. Inside, the cars gleamed under bright spotlights. Salesmen hovered, sharp-eyed and eager to pounce on anyone who looked like money. David took it all in with a steady gaze. He wasn't just browsing for a car, he was also observing the atmosphere. How were customers treated? Did the staff show professionalism? Did the business he had poured millions into truly reflect the standards he valued? The moment he stepped through the glass doors, he got his answer. Richard, the owner, spotted him almost immediately. David noticed how Richard's smile, wide and charming just a second earlier for another customer, flattened into a line the moment their eyes met. Richard didn't see a successful CEO or a hidden investor. He didn't see the man whose money had kept his doors open. He saw a black man in casual clothes. And in Richard's mind, that was enough to dismiss him. Instead of greeting David with courtesy, Richard walked straight toward him, blocking his view of the cars. His tone was sharp, his expression tight. "Sir," Richard said, almost sneering, "this isn't the kind of place you can just walk into." David raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" "These cars," Richard gestured dramatically around the showroom, "start at $80,000. Maybe you should try the used lot down the street." The words weren't just insulting, they were humiliating. Staff members nearby stiffened, uncomfortable. Customers exchanged curious glances. But no one spoke. No one challenged Richard. David kept his composure. He had dealt with this before. Too many times. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let the anger show. Calmly, he said, "I'm interested in one of the new models. Could I see the spec sheet?" Richard smirked, shaking his head. "We don't let people like you waste our time. These cars aren't for everyone." For a long moment, David stood still. He looked around at the showroom, at the cars his money had helped put there, at the staff whose salaries his investment covered. The irony of the moment was almost laughable. Inside, he felt the sting of disrespect. But alongside it came clarity. This wasn't about buying a car anymore. This was about principle. David slowly pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate, his voice calm and steady. "All right, then," he said. "If that's how you feel, let's handle this another way." Richard smirked again, convinced he had just scared off someone who didn't belong. To him, this was just another ordinary day of protecting his showroom from people who, in his mind, weren't worthy. But in reality, he had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. Because the man he had dismissed wasn't leaving. He wasn't defeated. He was making a call. A call that would change the fate of the dealership forever. And Richard, blinded by his ego, had no idea the storm that was about to walk through his doors. The phone call was short. Deliberate. To the point. David didn't need to explain much. A few words to his assistant, a time, a location, and silence followed. On the other end of the line, the wheels were already set in motion. Richard, meanwhile, stood smugly in the middle of the dealership showroom, his arms crossed over his chest. He thought he had won. In his mind, he had sent a nobody back where he belonged. His staff, though visibly uncomfortable, said nothing. They had seen this side of Richard before. He had a reputation for arrogance, for deciding in a single glance who was worth his time and who wasn't. But today felt different. David slipped his phone back into his pocket and quietly studied Richard. His face revealed nothing, his calmness almost unsettling. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. That silence seemed to irritate Richard even more. "You heard me," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't need window shoppers wasting time here. Especially the kind who clearly can't afford what we sell." David tilted his head slightly. His tone was smooth, steady. Are you always this quick to judge your customers? Richard barked out a laugh. Customers? You think you're a customer? You walked in here with sneakers and jeans. My real customers don't look like you. They don't come driving up in whatever that was you parked outside. The sting in his words didn't bother David, it exposed Richard for who he really was. That was enough. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching out longer than the last. The staff shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. A couple who had been looking at a luxury SUV whispered quietly, their eyes flicking between David and Richard. The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted from polished professionalism to something raw and tense. Then, it happened. Through the glass walls of the dealership, engines rumbled. At first faint, then louder, deeper, commanding attention. Heads turned. Outside, 3 black SUVs pulled into the lot, their windows tinted, their presence impossible to ignore. They moved in perfect synchronization, stopping in a neat row right at the front entrance. The showroom grew silent. Salesmen froze mid-step. Customers stopped mid-sentence. The doors of the SUVs opened, and out stepped men in sharp suits, calm, professional, carrying clipboards and leather folders. Their movements were crisp, deliberate, like they had rehearsed this 1,000 times. Richard's smirk faltered. He straightened his jacket, confusion flickering across his face. What is this?" he muttered. The men didn't waste time. They walked directly past Richard, their focus locked on David. One of them leaned in slightly, speaking low so only David could hear. "Sir, everything's ready. Do you want us to handle this now?" David gave a small nod. "Yes. Today's as good a day as any." The lead man turned, addressing the room in a clear, professional voice. "We're here on behalf of Mr. David Carter. There are matters of ownership and business that require immediate attention." Gasps rippled through the staff. Richard's eyes widened, his face draining of color. "Mr. Carter," he repeated, his voice cracking. His head whipped toward David, disbelief painted across his features. David finally let the calm mask slip just enough to let his words cut through the tension. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "You've spent the last 20 minutes lecturing me on who belongs here," David said quietly, but with undeniable authority. "And yet, this entire dealership belongs to me. Every car in this showroom, every paycheck your staff earns, every light overhead, my investment makes it possible." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced with raw panic. His staff looked at David with new eyes, respect written across their faces. The customers, wide-eyed, now realized they had just witnessed a humiliation that would be talked about for years. David let the weight of his words settle before adding, "Now, perhaps we should discuss who really doesn't belong here." The stage was set. The confrontation had begun. And Richard, for the first time in his career, was utterly powerless. The room felt like it had frozen in time. Every eye in the dealership was fixed on David. The same man Richard had mocked minutes earlier now stood revealed as the most powerful figure in the room. Richard's jaw slackened, his earlier bravado shattered. He stammered, trying to find words. Mr. Carter? That can't be right. You're his voice cracked, trembling with disbelief. "Yes," David said, his tone measured but commanding. "I am the silent investor who's been keeping this place afloat. I am the man who made sure your staff still had jobs when sales were collapsing. And I am the one who can decide, right here and right now, whether this dealership has a future." The lead member of David's legal team laid a thick folder on the polished counter. The sound of it hitting the glass was like a gavel slamming in a courtroom. He flipped it open, revealing contracts, agreements, and bank transfers. The truth was in black and white. Richard leaned forward, scanning the papers with wide eyes. He recognized the documents. His signature was on them. His hand shook as he traced the lines, finally realizing that the shell company behind the dealership's rescue was none other than David Carter's private equity firm. It was undeniable. The color drained from Richard's face. Beads of sweat gathered on his forehead as the full scope of his mistake crashed down on him. His empire wasn't his empire, it was David's. David took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Richard's. His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of a hammer. You looked at me and saw someone unworthy. Someone you thought didn't belong in your showroom. What you didn't see was the man who made this showroom possible. The staff, standing silently in the background, looked at David with newfound respect. Some even appeared relieved. They had lived under Richard's arrogance for years, and now they were witnessing the tables turn. Customers shifted uneasily, whispering to one another. They knew they were seeing something extraordinary, a moment of justice unfolding right before their eyes. Richard's lips trembled. "Mr. Carter, please. I didn't know. If I had known." David cut him off, his expression hardening. "That's the problem, Richard. Respect shouldn't depend on what you know about someone's bank account. It shouldn't depend on their clothes, their car, or the color of their skin. Respect is the bare minimum. And you failed to show even that." The words echoed through the room like a sentence being passed. Richard's knees seemed to weaken beneath him. His arrogance had always shielded him, but now that shield was gone, leaving him exposed and small. "Please, I can explain," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "It was a misunderstanding. You have to understand how important this dealership is. My family, my employees." David raised a hand, silencing him instantly. His tone shifted from cold anger to resolute finality. "Your employees will be fine. They are hard-working people who deserve better leadership than what you've given them. As for you," he paused, letting the weight of silence settle. "Your time is up." The legal team began pulling out additional paperwork, placing it neatly on the counter. The dealership's employees craned their necks, watching as documents were signed, initials marked, and agreements invoked. The air was thick with tension, but also with a sense of justice being served. Richard's eyes darted around the room, searching for sympathy, but none came. Even his staff wouldn't meet his gaze. He was alone. David turned slightly, addressing the employees and the few customers still present. "This place will continue. But not under leadership that devalues people based on appearance. Not under arrogance. Not under prejudice." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Some employees even nodded subtly, grateful for the words. Richard's shoulders slumped, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. He had been exposed, not just as a racist, but as a man whose success was borrowed, not built. David turned back to him one last time, his voice low but firm. "You judged me without knowing who I was. That was your mistake. And now, you'll live with the consequences." The final signature was inked. The reveal was complete. And Richard knew, in that moment, that everything he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. The ink was still drying on the withdrawal papers when the reality of Richard's downfall began to sink in. For years, he had strutted around the dealership like a king, convinced that charm and appearances made him untouchable. But now, as David's team packed up their documents, Richard looked like a man who had lost the very ground beneath his feet. The staff lingered in silence, torn between shock and relief. Many of them had suffered under Richard's arrogance, biting their tongues when he belittled people or played favorites. Some had even whispered about leaving, but jobs were scarce and bills needed paying. Today, they saw hope. David's words still echoed in their minds: "Respect is the bare minimum." Customers trickled out, murmuring to each other about what they had just witnessed. A few discreetly pulled out their phones, recording snippets of the scene. By the end of the day, the story would spread across social media: the racist car dealer who humiliated the wrong man, his own investor. Richard tried to regain his composure. He straightened his jacket, forced a smile, and attempted to act like nothing had happened. But his voice betrayed him when he called out, "All right, everyone, back to work. Let's keep this professional." No one moved. Instead, all eyes flicked toward David. In that moment, it was clear who the real leader was. David didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or humiliate Richard further. Instead, he addressed the staff with calm authority. "I want each of you to know something," he said. "Your jobs are not in danger because of this man's actions. What happens to this dealership moving forward will be about building a culture of fairness and respect. That means treating every single person who walks through those doors like they matter, because they do." The words landed heavily. A young salesman near the back gave a small nod. A receptionist, who had often been on the receiving end of Richard's temper, smiled faintly. For the first time in years, the staff felt like they were being seen. Richard, however, looked like a man unraveling. His eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to take his side. "You all know me," he pleaded. "I built this place. You've seen what I've done for this business. I made it what it is." But the silence that followed was deafening. Even those who once feared him refused to speak up. His empire wasn't just collapsing, it was crumbling in real time, and he was utterly alone. Within days, the story spread like wildfire online. A shaky video captured by a customer had gone viral: Richard's sneering dismissal of David, the arrival of the black SUVs, the reveal of David's ownership. Hashtags trended. News outlets picked up the story. The dealership, once a beacon of luxury, became a symbol of arrogance and prejudice. Customers canceled orders. Suppliers began calling in overdue payments. Banks, once eager to extend credit, now grew cautious. Behind the glossy glass walls, sales plummeted. Richard tried damage control, press releases, apologies, even hiring a PR firm, but the damage was too deep. His reputation was beyond repair. The community didn't just reject his dealership, they rejected him. Meanwhile, David's decision to withdraw his investment was swift and final. Without his millions, Richard had no lifeline. The lavish showroom began to empty, one car at a time. By the end of the quarter, where there had once been a thriving business, now stood rows of unsold vehicles and silent sales floors. For the employees, however, there was light. David quietly offered many of them positions at another dealership he had just acquired across town. There, they found a culture that valued people over appearances. They went from being pawns in Richard's empire to becoming part of a team where respect was non-negotiable. As for Richard, his fall was as dramatic as his arrogance. His name became a cautionary tale in the community, a reminder that wealth and status mean nothing without humility. He had lost not only his dealership but his pride, his reputation, and his place in the city's business circle. David, on the other hand, never once boasted about what had happened. He moved forward with the same quiet strategy that had built his empire in the first place. For him, the victory wasn't in destroying Richard, it was in proving a point. Prejudice has a cost. And sometimes, that cost is everything. Months had passed since the incident at the dealership, but the memory of that day remained etched in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. For the city, it became more than just a story about business. It became a story about justice, respect, and the consequences of arrogance. Richard's dealership was no more. The towering glass windows that once gleamed with polished vehicles now stood dark and dusty. The Grand Luxury Autos sign, once a beacon of exclusivity, was taken down piece by piece, leaving behind only an empty shell of a building. To the community, it was a monument to what happens when prejudice guides leadership. Richard himself had all but vanished from public life. Once a man who boasted at every charity gala and business luncheon, he now kept to himself. Whispers circulated about foreclosure, lawsuits, and failed ventures. The man who had dismissed people with a glance could no longer even hold his head high in his own neighborhood. But David Carter's story was very different. He had moved forward, as he always did, with quiet determination. The dealership he invested in across town flourished, not because it sold the most expensive cars, but because it welcomed everyone with dignity. Whether a customer walked in wearing a tailored suit or old work boots, they were greeted the same way, with respect. Employees thrived under the new culture. Some who had once worked under Richard now found themselves in leadership roles, empowered by David's vision. Word spread, and customers flocked, not just to buy cars, but because they wanted to support a business that represented fairness. For David, success wasn't about proving Richard wrong. It wasn't even about the millions he had gained or withdrawn. It was about living by a principle his mother had once taught him: respect is free to give, but priceless to receive. He often thought back to the moment Richard had blocked his path, dismissing him without a second thought. It wasn't the first time David had faced such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But that day had crystallized something important. Prejudice doesn't just hurt individuals, it destroys opportunities. It blinds people to potential, to partnerships, to growth. Richard's downfall wasn't because of David's power, it was because Richard's own arrogance had made him powerless. One evening, while walking through the new dealership, David paused at the sight of a young man nervously approaching the showroom. His clothes were simple, his shoes worn, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. The sales staff greeted him warmly, showing him the latest models without a hint of judgment. David watched from a distance, a quiet smile forming. This was the difference. This was the lesson. Later, at a business conference, David was asked about the viral story that had captivated the city. A journalist leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Carter, what do you think people should take away from what happened with Richard's dealership?" David paused before answering. He wasn't a man who enjoyed the spotlight, but he knew his words carried weight. "I think the lesson is simple," he said. "We live in a world where it's too easy to judge people by what you see on the surface. Their skin, their clothes, the car they drive. But real success, lasting success, comes when you learn to see beyond that. Richard lost everything, not because of me, but because he couldn't see people for who they really are. Respect should never be optional. It should be the foundation." The room fell silent for a moment before applause erupted. Not the kind of applause for a businessman who had made millions, but the kind given to a man who had spoken a truth everyone needed to hear. For David, that was enough. He didn't need to humiliate Richard further or hold on to bitterness. He had turned an ugly moment into a lasting lesson, not just for one man, but for an entire community. And as he left the stage that evening, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his managers: "Sales are up again this week. Customers keep saying they feel welcome here." David smiled to himself. That was the real victory. Not in tearing someone down, but in building something better. Because in the end, the story wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. And David Carter had shown the world that respect wasn't just good morals, it was good business.